It's good to see everyone here this morning. We'll be back in Romans. We're starting the Romans 11 chapter. A few months back, I remember I'd stopped Romans and I said I wanted to take some time to go through Romans chapter 9 through 11 because this 3 chapters have been misunderstood. They have been, you could easily get from Paul, the 9th and 10th chapters especially, you could get the idea that God has chosen some select few. And a lot of people conflate the 144,000 in the end times as being those God has chosen. Yeah, but that's not what it's talking about. He is talking specifically in these chapters to the Jewish people and their complaints, and said, their question, has God rejected the Jewish people? And so what he's saying is directed towards them and rejecting the idea that he's rejecting Israel as a group. So what we're going to be dealing with this morning is that remnant of Israel. That remnant who has embraced grace. So we'll just get started this morning in the very first verse, which addresses that. So Romans chapter 11, verse 1. It's there. We know it's there. All right. I am saying then, God did not reject his people. Let it not be. For I am also an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, does Israel's continuing unbelief mean Israel will never come to faith in Jesus? Does it mean that since Israel as a group, as a nation, rejected Christ, does that mean they'll never come to believe? That God has decided to cast them aside? Well, that's the correct question that Paul's Jewish readers here would naturally ask in light of chapters 9 and 10. Indeed, there are a lot of believers even today that ask that same question. And in the century since Paul wrote this, he said, well, why does this matter? Well, some believers, and even entire denominations today, have answered that question. Has God rejected Israel? They've answered it wrongly. They've concluded that God did reject Israel forever. They teach a view about Israel, and it's called replacement theology. They believe that the Gentile believers in the church, that they have replaced the Jewish people in God's plan. Guys, if you're reading the book of Revelation, and you're reading about the tribulation period, and you're putting the church in the tribulation period, and all the promises of Abraham, all the promises made to the Jewish people, and you've taken on those promises to yourself, to the church, you're wrong. Okay? Those promises don't belong to us. They belong to the Jewish nation that he made. Matter of fact, that he made to Abraham. And that's called replacement theology. The promises that God gave to the Jewish people are not the promises that he makes to us. And so when you view the end times, and you have this replacement theology, you're going to be all messed up in the head trying to figure it all out. Right, man? Both of you. Yeah. You're going to be all messed up. The promises he made to Abraham were for Abraham and his descendants. The promises he makes to the church, we ought to be thankful for the promises that he makes to the church. So, if Israel's rejection of the gospel was somehow both consistent with God's eternal plan in chapter 9 and Israel's own choosing in chapter 10, then does this mean that Israel's fate is settled and there's no possibility of restoration of Israel? Let it not be. Another way you could actually translate that is, God forbid. Despite Israel's present state, Israel is not permanently cast away. God still has plans and He has promises to keep to Israel. Paul says, I am also an Israelite. Paul's faith in Jesus as the Messiah proved that there were some Jews chosen by God who embraced the gospel. There were some Jews, not all Jews, rejected Christ. Just as not all Gentiles accepted Christ. But Paul is speaking in general terms as a nation. We ask the question today, is this a Christian nation in which we live today? There was a time when you'd say yes. You're starting to think about that now, aren't you? So, when we said it was a Christian nation, it did not mean everyone in the nation was a Christian. And this is the way Paul is referring to the Jews and to the Gentiles. He says, I am an Israelite. Alright? I am a Jew. And then he backs it up. Paul's faith in the Messiah, as Jesus as Messiah, proved that there were some Jews that was chosen by God who embraced the gospel. Paul says, you want to know how I know he didn't reject the Jews? I'm a Jew. And I accepted the gospel. He saved me. And notice again Paul's description. Paul called himself an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. These are terms that only Jews use to describe their heritage and who they are. So if God had rejected His people, there would be no believing of the Jews at all. Does that make sense? If He rejected the Jews as a people, there would be no Jews believing at all. So, even if one Jew is believing, is proof that God has not forsaken His people. Moreover, Paul says that the continuing existence of a believing Jewish remnant is proof of God's continual faithfulness to His people. Do we know of any Jews today that are believers of Jesus Christ? Yeah. There's an organization, Jews for Jesus. There are people today, Jewish people today, who are Christian believers of Jesus Christ, even today. Even though the nation 2,000 years ago rejected Jesus as a nation, even today there are Jews who are coming to believe in Him. And if God had no intentions of preserving His nation, Israel, then He would not have perpetuated the faith among the Jewish people. He would have withheld His mercy. Faith among the Jews would have died out, and the people would eventually cease to exist. Let me tell you something. If God wanted to wipe out His people, there were plenty of opportunities for Him to do it. Although there were some that tried. So let's look in verses 2 through 5. God did not reject His people whom He did know before, or had you all known and continue not to know, you all not known and continue not to know by Elijah what the Scripture is saying. how he is pleading with God against Israel. Oh Lord, this is Isaiah talking. Ezekiel talking. Yeah. Elijah talking. Your prophets they have killed. Your altars they have torn down. I was left alone and they are seeking my life. But what is the answer from God saying to him? How did God answer Elijah? I did leave to myself 7,000 men who did not bow a knee to Baal. So then also in the present time, Paul's present time, there has been and continues to be a remnant according to a choice of grace. Notice that last phrase? According to a choice of grace. In Paul's day, Israel was a group generally who rejected the Messiah. Yet there was a substantial remnant embraces the gospel of Jesus Christ. And God has often worked through a faithful remnant of Israel for his own ends, to embrace the gospel. As he did in the time of Elijah. Y'all remember the story of Elijah, right? He thought he was all by himself. He was standing up and he was being persecuted, sought to be killed. All he saw was evil in the world. All he saw, he thought that he was all alone. Lord, I'm by myself. There's no one else here. And he was having this big, gigantic pity party. He ended up in a little cave. Right? Remember that? God spoke to him. Quit it. I've got 7,000 people, faithful, who are working right now for me. You see, Lord, they had killed your own prophets. Elijah thought that God had cast off the nation and that he was the only one left serving the Lord. But God showed him that there was a substantial remnant. And though it was only a remnant, it was actually there. Essentially, Elijah was declaring what some were declaring in Paul's day, that the nation was lost because the Lord had forsaken his people Israel. It'd be easy for us to think that today, wouldn't it? Things not going well today. Not like it used to be, right? It seems like that we're becoming a little more persecuted, that our speech is a little more drowned out. It seems like that there's a whole lot of folks who are heathens out there, that they're anti-God, anti-religion, anti-church, anti-Jesus, well, you got it. You get the point. Seems like sometimes we're just all by ourselves. For our young people going to colleges today, they feel like that tremendously. Which is the great thing about our MBSFs and our other religious organizations in schools. Not every state allows that, by the way. When you get into a room with a professor and they start talking about evolution, they start trying to disintegrate your belief in God. And everyone else is going, okay. And you're left alone. It does feel a little bit like Elijah. Like you feel like Elijah felt. But that's not the truth. It's not reality. That's just exactly what Satan wants you to, how he wants you to feel. First, the Lord kept a remnant that Elijah knew nothing about. And second, this group was unknown to Elijah. The prophet believed he was truly alone in Israel. Everywhere he looked, he only saw apostasy and unbelief. Yet there were those who knew and trusted the Lord, but they weren't the powerful and they weren't the prominent. They were quietly serving God in the shadows. And then Paul says, at this present time, there's a remnant. You know, we often think that God needs a whole lot of people to do a great work. You know, sometimes it feels like that, we can't do a great work unless we have a lot of people. Our churches suffer for that thought because in the process of trying to get people, we forget to do the work. But you know, God often works through a small group or through a group that starts out small. And though not many Jews in Paul's days, they actually did embrace Jesus as Messiah, a remnant did. And God will use that small group, that remnant of the Jews in a big, big way. By the way, all the apostles, they were Jews also, weren't they? A small group, a band of people who followed Christ. They were Jews. And look what they did. They turned the world upside down. So Paul says in the same way that we will find a precise number of Israel preserved from apostasy by God's gracious choice. That 144,000 you find in Revelation, it's not the Jehovah's Witnesses. Sorry. It's not God's elect super Christians. No, it's not you. It's not me. That 144,000 are that remnant that God's talking about. The 144,000 Jews that He's preserved. That's the remnant. That's the group He's going to work with. That's the group He's going to use. You know, it was not the number as much as the permanence of God's plan for Israel that mattered in the time of Elijah. Didn't have to have an army. He just had to have a number. You see, he put his trust in God's grace, not in numbers. The last section of this passage, I call it the provision of the remnant. Let's look at this in verse 6. Now listen to this. Remember what the last phrase was? Go back to the last verse. But a remnant. There has been and continues to be a remnant according to a choice of grace. Now let's go to verse 6. And if by grace, then not from works. In that case, grace, if it's by works, then grace is no longer being grace. What then? What Israel is seeking for, this it did not obtain. But the chosen ones did obtain it, and the rest became unwilling to hear. Just as it has been written and continues to be written, God did give to them a spirit of grogginess. That's my word. Grogginess. To not see at the eyes, and not to hear of the ears until this very day. And David is saying, let their table become a snare and a net into a stumbling block, and for a repayment to them. Let it darken their eyes so that to see not, and through all let their back bend down. There's a lot there, guys. But that first phrase in verse 6, and by grace, then not from works. In that case, grace is no longer being grace. Paul left the previous verse noting that the remnant was chosen according to the election of grace, not because of the election of works. Now he reminds us what grace is by definition. Grace is the free gift of God. Not given to with an eye to performance. Not to say, hey, you've been really good, so I'm going to give you something. You've lived your life spectacularly for Christ, so I'm going to give you grace. No, that was how Israel was doing it. That was how Israel was trying to obtain God's favor. But only out of the kindness of the giver can grace actually be grace. And if you want God to reward the zealousness of Israel, then you're voting for God to get rid of grace for everyone. And then suddenly, if that was the case, we'd all find ourselves in an impossible race to earn salvation. I thank God for the grace that He's given me because I can't earn it. I'm tired. You know, I would be so tired of trying to earn God's favor. And every time I do some good things, that I turn around and I mess up. Do you ever find yourself like that? It seems like that every time you do something good, something happens and you slip up. And what we end up doing is trying to hide it from everybody else, but God knows. And you know that He knows. So either we accept that God finds those He chooses to receive His mercy, or we seek to find God's mercy by our own efforts. So if it's works, it's no longer grace. Do you realize grace and works do not go together? They're oil and water. You see, if giving is by grace, it cannot be of works, and if it's of works, it cannot be grace. And Paul explains that the righteousness Israel is seeking through the works of law has not been obtained. None of them has obtained their salvation through works. Do you know of anybody that's obtained their salvation through works? You know anybody? Even in the denominations that believe that you have to work in order to earn God's grace, can you go to them and say, are you saved? Well, I'm working on it. None of them can actually tell you, yeah, I'm saved, I'm going to heaven. It doesn't matter what happens to me in my life, how evil, terrible a person I could be. So I can't change the fact that I know I've accepted God's grace. That's as simple as that. I can't earn it. By the way, I can't lose it. I can't lose it. So, you see, the nation of Israel as a whole has not found righteousness. A remnant did, but as a whole has not found righteousness. Righteousness came for them in the person of Jesus. He came to them as their Messiah. And you know what they did? You know what they said when it came to the time of accepting or rejecting? They said, crucify Him. That's what they said. It was an out-and-out rejection by the nation of Israel. Not by everybody, but as a nation, but as a whole. They failed to confess Christ in faith, and the Lord continually withholds His mercy for the majority of the Jews. Doesn't mean they can't be saved. Well, I'm going to tell you something. If you're a believing, practicing Orthodox Jew, you're probably not being convicted right now, unless God intervenes. That's what He said. So Israel continues pursuing the wrong way to get to God, while saving faith continues to be found by Gentiles. Now the elect have attained it. And it says, he says, the rest were hardened. The elect among Israel received and responded to the mercy of God, but the rest were hardened by their rejection. Those quotations that we find at the end from Isaiah 29, Psalm 69, tells us that God can give a spirit of grogginess. When y'all wake up in the morning, are you like little Gavin? Hey, it's morning! And you're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and you're all thinking straight. That's probably not, I would not consider myself that way. Right? Amen. Oh, I'm trying to go. No, just 5 more minutes. And you can't hardly see, so you stumble out of bed, you can't hardly see, and you're walking like this, you know, and you're kind of going, and you can't, your thoughts are, you know, are not very coherent. It's the spirit of grogginess. Now, some versions say other things, and they're right in it. I like that thought. A stupor. They're living life groggy. Can you imagine going through all day with your head not cleared up? Getting out of it all day long, you're going to be the same way as if you walked out of bed, climbed out of bed. Had eyes that they should not see. And he can say, let their eyes be darkened as he pleases. If God is pleased to enlighten only a remnant of Israel at the present time, he may do so as he pleases. Why? He's God, and they're not. Doesn't mean they can't be saved. It just means that they haven't woke up. They're living their lives trying to please God through form, rituals, and ceremonies. They're trying to please God through their works. They're trying to please God through, through their religion. Those silly Jews. We would never do that, would we? We would never try to please God through our forms, rituals, and religion. It happens all the time, guys. There are people today who are filling the pews in missionary Baptist churches who are groggy. They have never come to the understanding that Jesus Christ is His grace. Yes, they've heard the gospel over and over again. Do you ever wonder why it is that the person could hear the gospel over and over and over again and never truly respond to it? It's a spirit of grogginess. You see, an attitude of deadness towards spiritual things. We got churches filled with people like that today. They're just going thinking that if I go to church, I can be saved. I'll be all right. If I do good things, it'll be okay. God will He'll have to let me in. If I give my offering, if I'm faithful giving my offering, well, I'm doing a good thing. You're going to let me in. Believe it or not, we got people in our churches who believe this is their form of salvation, is become a member of a Baptist church. They believe that would somehow, be getting that name on that roll book, somehow will get you on that one. It happens today. It is simply not true. David in Psalm 69 says, let their table become a snare and stumbling block. And this quote is Jesus speaking prophetically through David, asking the Father to bring retribution upon those who crucified Jesus. Israel's table refers to the banquet table that opens the kingdom. The idea is that men are sitting and they're feasting comfortably at their banquet. And their very sense of safety has become their ruin. They're so secure in the way they fancy their fancy safety that the enemy can come on unaware. They think they're okay. They think they're okay. The Jews of Paul's days were so secure in the idea of them being the chosen people. They had the right lineage. They had the right names, the last names. That very idea became the thing that ruined them. I call it church worship. Religion worship. Man worship. Christ worship. So when Jesus came to Israel, the table was set for Israel in the sense that Israel could have received the kingdom if they would have received Jesus as their king. But instead, they rejected Jesus. So Jesus says, let their rejection be the cause for God to withhold the kingdom from Israel. Okay? They rejected. This will be the cause for them not to enter into the kingdom. Remember all the disciples saying, when are you going to bring about the kingdom? The kingdom. Oh, he's going to do it. But it wasn't going to be then. You know why? Because they rejected him. They said no. As a nation. So what could have been Israel's ticket to the kingdom became just cause for God to withhold the kingdom and keep Israel under judgment. We need to understand something. He's talking about nations. He's not talking about individual people. He's comparing God's plan for the Jewish nation with the plans for the Gentiles. That's the question we've been following since the start of chapter 9. We can't apply what Paul is saying to the circumstances of a single individual, whether Jew or Gentile. But we can understand what he's talking about between salvation of works and salvation of grace. And the hardening of our heart when we continually reject his invitation to come. You see, I believe that so many people miss the kingdom, miss their opportunity for salvation because they're comfortably secure in their thoughts about they're all right with God. Because they're doing thus, and this, and that. And that's the reason why you find so many people whose life falls apart, they come to Jesus. They have this come to Jesus. Because they messed up in their life. And they know that they need Christ. And they come. But what about the people who've never messed up that bad in life and they have a good life and God has blessed them tremendously. But you know what? They're just as lost as a goose. But they think they're okay. The nation of Israel thought that they were okay because they were doing all the things that they thought that they were doing all the things that the law commanded them to do. And as long as they kept that law, they'd be fine with God. The problem is they couldn't keep it. And as we found in Romans, as we're journeying through Romans already, it's just one sin that gives you the death penalty. And only God can remove that penalty through his blood, through his saving grace. So this morning, it does seem like in this world today that we're alone. I believe that God is using the remnant to accomplish his work and his work. I believe that there are many people today who are hardened from hearing God's word and applying it to their heart. So what does this mean? Does this mean that we should stop telling the world about Christ? Does this mean that we should never reach out to the Jewish people with the gospel of Jesus? Does this mean that we should never reach out to those hardened criminals, those deranged people of the world, those, quote, evil people of the world? Does that mean that we should stop because obviously God hasn't chosen them? Does that mean any of that? And the answer is no. We are to spread the gospel. Because, remember what he said? Whosoever might believe will be saved. Whether it's a Jew. And I don't know who God is hardening their hearts. If God can harden a heart, He can do what? Soften a heart. And the best way to soften a heart is to tell them about Jesus. If you're here this morning and you have never truly asked Jesus to save you, you've never let Him become the Messiah, the deliverer of your life, but you think that you're okay because you've always come to church, you've always done good things, this is an issue, this is a warning. You're not all right. You're trying to earn your salvation the way Israel was trying to earn it, and that's through your own good works and efforts. When you come to Jesus and you realize your need for salvation, it's because you've humbled yourself to Him and said, Lord, I can't do this myself. Terry, there's never been somebody who's recovered that didn't admit that they had a problem, right? Yes, it's the very first thing. You have to understand that you can't do it yourself, that you've got to that you've got to come to someone who can do it for you. And then you have to submit your life and your heart to Him and accept His everlasting grace, His everlasting salvation. May I suggest to you today that you need to do it today if you haven't? Because I want you to be able to say, I know that I'm where I'm going to be when I pass from this life. When I take my last breath, I know where I'm going to be. I want you to know that. I want you to remember that time when Jesus came into your heart, into your life. I want you to remember that time when He made you a child of His. I want you to remember that He said, I'll never leave you nor I'll never forsake you. And that no one can pull you out of His hand. I want you to remember that. And if you've never had that experience, I'd be praying right now for His grace. And quit relying on yourself to please God. So as we stand prepared for an invitation, I don't know your heart. I don't know what state of spirit you're in. But I will tell you that God knows. And He uses moments like these to touch and impress upon your heart. Now, you may have had a hard heart for years and years and years, and the gospel's never penetrated, but you know what? It can. He will, if you call on Him, if you trust in Him, you believe in Him, and you accept His grace. He can save you. So as we sing, would you let God deal with you today? In whatever way, maybe it's salvation, maybe it's your spiritual life. It could be all kinds of things God is dealing with you. Maybe there's sin in your life, whatever it is. Would you come and get it right with Him today as we sing?
Number 544. 544.